Imagine, if you will, a podcast. A podcast beyond that which is known to man. It exists in both fandom and discovery, in viewing and critiquing. My name is Matt Hurt. This is Anthology. Hello and welcome to Anthology, presented by ObsessiveViewer.com. If this is your first time listening, Anthology is a podcast exploring science fiction anthology storytelling during television's first golden age, beginning with The Twilight Zone. Each podcast, I share my thoughts on an episode of this iconic series as a first-time viewer, as well as share some trivia about the episode. I then end each podcast with a bonus review of a movie or show related to the week's episode. For more of Anthology, go to anthologypod.com, and if you want to contact me, you can do that on the Facebook page at facebook.com/anthologypod. You can tweet me at ObsessiveViewer, send an email to matt@obsessiveviewer.com, or call and leave me a voicemail at 317-762-6099. And if you like what you hear and want to support the podcast, please head over to iTunes and leave a rating and review. The more ratings and reviews I get, the easier it will be for people to find the show in iTunes' search results. And if you wish to support Anthology with your wallet, there's a donate button on anthologypod.com and a link in the show notes of this episode. Every donation made using that donate button goes directly toward the fees to keep the podcast running. Finally, if you're in Indianapolis, my friends and I at the Obsessive Viewer are hosting an event on October 14th. It's the third annual Shocktober in Irvington, where we rent out the Irving Theater and screen short horror films from local filmmakers. We also interview the filmmakers between each screening and raffle off DVDs, Blu-rays, and gift cards to local businesses. All the proceeds go right to the Irvington Historical Society and help support a great community in Indianapolis. And as a bonus for Anthology listeners, you can get $1 off the price of admission by using the promo code PODCAST2 when you buy your tickets. And if you can't make it, but you still want to donate to the Historical Society, you can do that on the link to buy tickets that can be found at shocktoberinirvington.com. On this week's episode of Anthology, I'll be discussing Long Live Walter Jameson. It's the 24th episode of The Twilight Zone's first season, and it aired March 18th, 1960 on CBS. And based on the recommendation of listener Greg, for this week's bonus review, I'll be sharing my thoughts on Tithonus, an episode of the X-Files' sixth season that aired on January 24th, 1999. And speaking of Greg, he actually emailed in response to last week's episode reviewing A World of Difference. And I'll go ahead and read that email. If you guys remember, last week on the podcast, I referenced, or I mentioned a theory that maybe the goings on in A World of Difference was due to doppelgangers like the ones that were in Mirror Image. So, Greg writes, or how about Jerry's doppelganger found his way into Jerry's world, ran amok, and then left Jerry to clean up the mess? Maybe the drunkenness and delinquency are not Jerry's doing, but his doppelganger's. In fact, while Jerry's doppelganger was destroying Jerry's reputation and threatening his livelihood, Jerry was off playing the role of Arthur Curtis, the doppelganger having erased all of Jerry's memories of his former life. As far as Jerry was concerned, his new life as Arthur Curtis was his life all along, and so he didn't protest. The doppelganger, though, at some point tired of being Jerry and deciding to return to the world that real Jerry now occupied, only real Jerry had no memory of his world because the doppelganger neglected to restore to him his memories. So you can imagine Jerry's shock having to deal with the shrew and fed-up studio bosses the doppelganger wrought. Jerry, though, gets even without any awareness of it, of course. He somehow finds his way back into the world he now thinks is his own, sending the doppelganger to the world he fled and the mess he will now rightfully have to confront. That's a very unique perspective on it, and that's a really good way to run with the idea of doppelgangers, like in Mirror Image, and attributing and attributing it's to this episode, and really clever. And I think that if you were to take this storyline and expand it into a longer narrative, with this, it could be a really unique premise for a movie or a longer episode or what have you. So thanks, Greg. And also, Greg wrote, have you seen that episode of Black Mirror called White Christmas? And he says more, but I'm going to save that for here in about a month or so, because I'm going to be doing bonus episodes about Black Mirror. So I'm really looking forward to doing those. So I'm going to get those going here soon. So you'll find out what Greg has to say about Black Mirror, the Christmas special episode White Christmas, in the weeks to come. So, having said all of that, let's go ahead and talk about Long Live Walter Jameson. As I said, it aired on March 18th, 1960. And of course, before I get to my thoughts on the episode, I'm going to go ahead and read this plot summary. This week it's from Wikipedia, because the Twilight Zone companion is in my bedroom and I'm lazy. And of course, this is going to be spoiler heavy, so if you haven't seen the episode, please go watch it and come back and listen. Walter Jameson, a college professor, is engaged to a young doctoral student named Susanna Kittredge. Susanna's father, Sam Kittredge, another professor at Jameson's college, becomes suspicious of Jameson because he does not appear to have aged in the 12 years they have known each other, and seems to have unrealistically detailed knowledge of some pieces of history that do not appear in texts. Jameson at one point reads from an original Civil War diary in his possession. Later, Kittredge discovers the truth after recognizing his future son-in-law in a Matthew Brady Civil War photograph. Jameson had earlier denied having an ancestor in the war. Moreover, the man in the photograph has the same facial mole and wears the same ring as Jameson. Jameson also ultimately reveals his real-life history, which includes the fact that agelessness, but no kind of immunity to injury, was imparted to him by an alchemist more than 2,000 years ago. Jameson indicates that he is old enough to have known Plato personally. Jameson does not know what was done to him by the alchemist, only that the alchemist was gone when he recovered, and he then stopped aging while everyone around him continued with normal living. Soon he had to leave and become a constant refugee. Kittredge asks Jameson to share his gift with him, but Jameson does not know how. Jameson tells Kittredge that even if he could share it with him, it would only make him immortal from that point forward. He asks Kittredge if he would want to be a 70-year-old man forever. Jameson tells Kittredge that he learned a terrible lesson from living for so long and reveals his desire to die. Jameson mentions that he keeps a revolver in his desk drawer but does not have the courage to use it. Kittredge soon realizes that if Jameson marries his daughter, she will grow old and Jameson will eventually abandon her in order to keep his secret. Kittredge then refuses permission for Jameson to marry his daughter. In spite of this, Jameson proposes to Susanna, and they plan to immediately elope. Unbeknownst to Jameson, he is being stalked by an elderly woman. She is Lorette Bowen, one of his many wives and consorts through the years, whom he had abandoned when she grew old and frail while he remained young. She claims that she cannot allow Jameson to destroy another woman's life. She discovers Jameson's pistol lying on his desk and impulsively shoots him. Kittredge passes by Lorette as she is making her escape. When he enters Jameson's study, he finds Jameson bleeding but seemingly at peace. Soon, Jameson starts to rapidly age. Kittredge attempts to help, but nothing can be done, and Jameson collapses on the floor. Susanna enters the house, and Kittredge tries to stop her from seeing the aged Jameson, saying only that he is gone. He is unable to keep her out of the room, but once inside, she discovers only an empty suit of clothes with a white substance near the collar and sleeves. When Susanna asks what is on the floor, the professor replies, "Dust, only dust." Okay, before I get to my thoughts on this episode, I'm going to go ahead and go with a talent rundown. Long Live Walter Jameson stars Kevin McCarthy as Professor Walter Jameson. This was his only episode of The Twilight Zone. However, he was also in one episode of Way Out, the Roald Dahl anthology series. He appeared in 1961's The Overnight Case. And obviously he was most notably known for the 1956 Invasion of the Body Snatchers. And he also had an appearance in the Twilight Zone movie and Inner Space from 1987. And kind of an interesting thing that I found, first this was the second most talked about role that he was in, that he always got mentions of, the first one being, of course, Invasion of the Body Snatchers. But on his DVD commentary for this episode, I thought that this was an interesting and terrible piece of trivia about his childhood, but he talked a little bit about how his parents passed away when he was about 4.5 years old, and that he later ran away from what he referred to as a gruesome foster home, and in the hopes of finding like an orphanage. And it was just really kind of crazy to hear him talk about it in the DVD commentary for this episode. Co-starring in this episode as Professor Sam Kittredge is Edgar Staley. This was his only episode of The Twilight Zone. He also appeared in 4 episodes of Tales of Tomorrow, including the episode What You Need, which I reviewed in episode 7 of Anthology. And he also appeared in 1 episode of One Step Beyond in 1960's Goodbye Grandpa. And he also had a part in the movie Seconds, which I reviewed in episode 12 of the podcast. He was known as a character actor with a penchant for dialects. He was most famous on the radio as the voice of scientist Dr. Hewer in the serial Buck Rogers in the 25th Century. During the 1930s and 40s, he starred in many radio dramas, including Crime Doctor, Gangbusters, and Inner Sanctum. And on Broadway, he was best known for originating the role of Dr. Herman Einstein in Arsenic and Old Lace. Also appearing in this episode is Estelle Winwood as Laurette Bowen. This was her only episode of The Twilight Zone, and she passed away in 1984 at the age of 101, actually. And rounding out the cast is Dodie Heath as Susanna Kittredge. This was her only episode of The Twilight Zone, but she also did appear in the movie Seconds. And writer for this episode was Charles Beaumont. And this episode, like, knowing that is pretty sad when you consider his kind of tragic story. He had an early death. That was pretty shocking. He suffered from, I've stated this previously, but he suffered from a degenerative aging disease, which gave him the appearance of an elderly man at the age of 38. And it was speculated that he was suffering simultaneously from Pick's disease and early onset Alzheimer's. And just knowing that he wrote this episode, which at its heart is about mankind and immortality and what it means to experience life, knowing what his life story was going to be after this is just really tragic. Puts a dark twist on the episode. Director for this episode was Anton Leader. This is his first of 2 episodes. We'll next see his work in Season 3's episode The Midnight Sun. He also directed Children of the Damned and 2 episodes of Lost in Space and 1 episode of Star Trek. So we've come to my feelings as a viewer on this episode of The Twilight Zone. Before seeing this episode for the first time, I was only aware of the title, Long Live Walter Jameson, and I knew pretty much nothing else about it. And I just kind of assumed from the title that it had to do with immortality. So I'll go ahead and pat myself on the back for knowing that. So as far as the plot is concerned, I thought this was a really good setup for the story. Like the episode does a really good job of setting up the story. From the outset, we see that Sam and Walter are both friends, and like they have a shared interest in Sam's daughter, Susanna. And what I love about it is that it humanizes the whatever conflict is there. It's not a conflict that's born out of greed, hate, anger, or that type of antagonism. The kind of central conflict is Sam wanting to know about Walter's immortality, partly because he wants to make sure that his daughter is marrying the right person, and also because he fears death and he wants to live forever as well. But the way this episode approaches that, and the way that the characters approach it, is in this realistic and respectful and intellectual way that I really, really appreciated, and I'll heap praise upon it throughout the rest of this review, obviously. But I loved that's how we're introduced to this story. There's no like central driving force of tension throughout the episode. It's all this drama about this old man who is wanting to do right by his daughter, and the man who is in love with the daughter, and at the center is this mystery that builds up between them. And I really love the structure of this episode as well. It has like 3 separate like segments to the story, essentially. So it opens up with the central mystery about Walter, and it's about Sam's probing to find information on it. And then it transitions into this philosophical debate and this conversation between the two men about what it means to be a human, and what it means to have a finite lifespan, and the implications of living forever. And then at the end, there's this bit of comeuppance that comes about somewhat suddenly. And I don't know, with that structure, it felt like I was watching a play, or at least it lended itself a very theatrical feel, and I really respected that and appreciated that. So I'm going to kind of break down my thoughts on the plot through those 3 segments. So first I'm going to talk about the mystery, and setting up Walter Jameson as a professor speaking so vividly about the Civil War, that gives this episode and gives us just a ton of information up front while still preserving the mystery. And it's so great because it introduces us to Walter Jameson. It introduces us to him as this charismatic professor person who speaks very eloquently and very vividly about a subject that he is obviously very interested in. It introduces us to him as a very popular professor and lecturer. It introduces us to the friendship between him and Sam. It introduces us to Sam's suspicions of him in a way that doesn't convey what it is that he's trying to uncover, or what it is that Walter is trying to hide. And it also just gives us a lot of information. It also hints at the relationship between Walter and Susanna. So all of that is just packed so neatly in this one opening scene. And I love the moment when Sam asks Walter if he can borrow the diary that Walter was reading from. And I feel like this subtext was there because most of this is unspoken, but maybe I'm reading into it. But on the one hand, Walter's response is because Walter is protective of his private journal, and it's a piece of himself and his history, so obviously he's not going to loan it out. And on the other hand, I feel like he knows that Sam is suspicious of him, and that Sam is trying to dig for answers and could potentially compare the handwriting or what have you. But like I said, most of that is pretty unspoken, but I thought that it was a really good piece of storytelling to kind of propel us into the scenes to come, and especially the after dinner scene that I'll talk about next up, I guess. So Sam has this pseudo interrogation of Walter that I found just so fantastic. Again, it's this intellectual probing, and it's not really a threatening thing because they're colleagues. They respect one another. They're friends. And I can't get over it. This is such a smart way to deliver this plot because it grounds the episode in such a way that it makes it feel so authentic. It makes this really out there premise of this immortal 2,000 plus year old man. It makes it feel grounded in reality. And these characters have such human reactions to these things that the show could have easily been about this greedy man demanding to know the truth about how to become immortal. And maybe that would shed away his humanity and end in some big moment where he kills the immortal man or what have you. But in the context of this episode, the way that it all plays out, it's such a better way. It's 10 times more compelling. And, because if they would have gone that route, it would have just kind of clouded the message and been just needlessly dramatic. So the way that it was written is just so great and so much better. And the fact that they're playing a game of chess is, I mean, it's kind of an overt metaphor, but I thought that was a nice touch, and it was a good piece of, it was a great visual cue to usher us into this philosophical debate that they have after Walter admits the truth. So once Walter admits the truth, there's a transition in the tone of the episode. It switches from the mystery to the more philosophical debate of Sam and Walter. And it's set up so wonderfully because Sam is this older guy who he wants to be immortal, and throughout their conversation, Walter explains to him why it is that men should not aspire toward immortality. And just they go through so many different avenues with this conversation because Walter just asks him, it's such a beautiful piece of dialogue, and I apologize I don't have it right in front of me, but when Walter asks Sam when he would want to stop aging, he asks 30 years old, 70, and just the way that he frames that scenario to Sam and the way he talks about seeing all of his loved ones grow old and die, it just brings so much depth and meaning to this episode. And I loved it for this. I really did love it for this reason. And his words are kind of punctuated by the statement that he makes that, he says, it's death that gives this world its point. And that line is just so great. I loved everything about this conversation. And on the flip side of that, Sam asks Walter or he says that he would have thought that men would have gotten wiser with age. Like this man is 2,000 years old, you would think that he would become wiser. And I thought it was really kind of poignant that Walter just says, you just go on living. And that's just, it comes from, it's dialogue that comes from a man who's tired. He's tired of aging. He's setting the record straight for this guy who thinks that this situation that Walter has, or this, affliction, if you want to call it that Walter has, is a gift rather than a curse. And I really like how upfront and honest Walter is with Sam overall. Throughout this entire episode, there's this mutual respect, for the most part. I'll get to that in a moment, but, there's this mutual respect throughout the episode, and Walter even goes so far as to explain that he wanted to resign his post and move on to spare Susanna, because he could tell that Susanna was falling in love with him, but then he fell in love with her. And that alone, that's something that I loved about this episode, because this guy is, like I said, he's over 2,000 years old. He's immortal, but he's a man or he's a man with this supernatural quirk, ability, curse, whatever you want to call it, but he's still a human being. He still has the capacity to fall in love. It hasn't ripped away his humanity at all, for the most part. And I liked that bit of characterization. Walter Jameson as a character is just a really well-rounded, character. So having said all of that, the turn where he tells Susanna that he wants to marry her tonight, that's a little odd, or at the very least, it's purely plot driven. I didn't mind it too much, but it really felt like it was added solely into the story to get Walter out of Sam's house and back to his study, and to remind the audience of his relationship with Susanna for what's to come with Lorette in the scene at the end. And I guess it serves that purpose. It does reinforce the relationship, and that does give Lorette's sudden appearance a lot more weight to it. But I don't know. After seeing this sort of play out between Walter and Sam, where these they're two colleagues having a discussion, and they're both, they're friends. After going through all that, it felt like a middle finger to Sam. After the episode so clearly paints the two as companionable colleagues, and it's like he's literally stealing her away from Sam, and it's kind of, I don't know, it kind of rubbed me the wrong way. Like I said, I didn't mind it too much, but it did feel a little plot convenient and a little out of character for what had been playing out up to that point. So for the last act of the story, or the last segment of the story, we have Walter Jameson's comeuppance. And I hesitate to say comeuppance because he has been depicted as this kind of gentle, charismatic, or what have you person. He's not an evil person. He's still a human. He's dealing with this curse that he has, and the worst I can say about him is that he's not regretful of the things he's done. He hasn't done anything overtly terrible to anyone. He's just left tons and tons of women to die alone, which is a really horrible thing, but it's also something out of necessity for his situation, to avoid him having this conversation that he had in this night with Sam. So I guess it wouldn't really be his comeuppance so much as him coming of age, as it were. When it comes to Lorette's actions in the study at the end of the episode, I really like that they don't necessarily come out of hatred or vengeance. She's introduced, and she has her whole expository dialogue where she explains what's happening, and I mean, it is out of hatred and vengeance. I should retract that. But it's framed in a way that she's been slighted by this man, and she doesn't want to see the love of her life become the love of someone else's life. And she feels cheated. She feels cheated that this man has, maybe she feels cheated, I don't know, maybe I'm reading into that, but she feels cheated that this man has so many loves throughout his life, and she wants him for herself. So all that's to say that she's a murderer, plain and simple, but it's a crime of passion that's born from this pain that came from the circumstances of Walter Jameson's condition. And so it does come out of hatred or vengeance, but it's not purely hatred or vengeance. It's a passion. It's a crime of passion. But the thing that I noticed the most of this scene, out of this scene in the study, is that her shooting him comes after she touches his hand. And I freaking loved his reaction to it. She touches his hand, and then Kevin McCarthy stands up and kind of backs away. He winces and he kind of jumps back. And it's almost like he fears old age. He's been alive for over 2,000 years, and a single old woman touching him seems somewhat revolting to him. It's kind of, in a sense, it's him being confronted with his potential mortality, I think. And it can also be seen as Walter being in denial about her age. And maybe I'm reading into it here, but he didn't initially recognize her, or at least he pretended not to know her. But considering the fact that he spent what could have been a lifetime with her, or a portion of a lifetime with her, and it's likely that at that time he really did love her, just as he loves Susanna now in the episode. When this elderly person claiming to be the same woman who he only has memories of in her youth, and when she touches him, it triggers this response of revulsion and maybe resentment too. He could very well resent that she's aged while he can't. And this is where maybe I've given Walter Jameson a little bit of credit as a character, because he's practiced at using people and leaving them. This is that's his MO. That's what he does, and it's out of necessity. But this scene with Lorette is him being confronted by that, and he's being confronted by the pain that he's caused people. And what I enjoy about it, that's the reason why I'm able to give Walter Jameson so much credit, is because when Sam comes to his aid after Walter's been shot, Walter's response is this really great, very distant sounding assurance that he says to Sam that either way you'll be rid of me. I've come to my senses. So this is a callback to his remark about men never getting wiser, and how they just go on living, because it seems like that's the way that he says either way you'll be rid of me is fantastic, because he knows that I get the sense maybe he's not 100% sure if he is mortally wounded, but that says to me that he's saying that, okay, well, either I'm about to die or I live and you're gonna be rid of me. Well, maybe he's referring to, maybe he didn't change, but my read on it is that if he doesn't die, he's seen the error of his ways. He's going to dump Susanna and not steal her life away from her to spend with someone who can't grow old with her. That's where I feel like he says, I've come to my senses, comes into play. And I just love that line, because it says so much about his journey as a character through this short episode of The Twilight Zone. And of course, I'll talk about the effects at the end of the episode, but overall, I think that in terms of plot and story, I think that this tells a very, very strongly written story about two men having a conversation, and one man coming to terms with who he is as a person and the things that he's done to the people in his life out of necessity, and in him kind of coming of age and coming to some realizations about who he is. So as far as performances in this episode, obviously this episode is very much driven by Kevin McCarthy, Edgar Staley, and Estelle Winwood. But I do want to point out that there's a scene that, I mean, this was after watching it a few times, I didn't notice this until I watched it a few times, but there's a scene when Edgar Staley tells Dodie Heath, or playing Susanna, to go upstairs after dinner so that he and Walter can talk. I didn't notice this, but it's a really cute little thing that Dodie Heath does when Edgar Staley's back is turned to her. She sticks her tongue out at him, and I have no way of knowing if this was scripted from the beginning, but it feels like it may have been kind of improvised. I don't know if that's the case or not, but I thought it was funny, and it felt really natural, and I enjoyed that. but yeah, I loved Edgar Staley's performance in this episode so much. There's something in his voice, like hesitation or this carefulness in his questioning, of Walter, that's mixed with this profound curiosity. And when he all but begs Walter to give him the secret to immortality, like that, the combination of what he's doing in this episode is just, it's so fluid. Like he goes from so many different, he weaves in and out of like different modes. Like he's the concerned father. He's the, curious colleague. He's the old man faced with his mortality. And it's just so fluid the way that he navigates these different avenues of his character. And I just love the way that he performs this role so much. And of course, Kevin McCarthy, just all around is really great. He really sells the charisma of Walter Jameson. He could have been a very, self-assured or cocky person, or a very arrogant guy, because, he's 2,000 years old. But he's such an amiable guy, or he's such a pleasant personality, and you can kind of see how Susanna would fall in love with him, and Sam would be such great friends with him. And there's a line I want to say, or the scene I want to single out for Kevin McCarthy is that after he's been shot, the way that he speaks, you can tell that it's like the character is straining. And from my perspective, it kind of felt like, okay, well, he's clearly dying, but it's kind of interesting when you think about it, because knowing that he's about to start aging, it's almost like the strain in his dialogue isn't him dying, it's him aging. And it's just interesting because throughout the entire episode, McCarthy plays Jameson has this kind of smooth, somewhat gentle guy. And the distant way he speaks after he's been shot is like, it's almost like his brain is catching up with what's happening in his body. And I mean, it could be construed as, or it could be interpreted as just, oh, he's in shock from being shot. But I think that there's a little bit more to it, as his character his body is transforming, to him dying of old age, essentially, or dying of the gunshot wound, and in a new body, essentially. So I really liked that. And Estelle Winwood's performance is really great too. You can really, like, she's not in it a lot. She kind of pops up at the end, but when she gives her monologue to Walter, it's like you can tell the hurt that she has in the way that she reads it. It's really strong. As far as the technical side of this episode, of course, I'm going to talk about the special effects of the aging of Walter Jameson. They're astounding. They're just fantastic. According to trivia, it was achieved by applying red-colored age makeup to McCarthy's face, and then what they did was they lit the set with red key lights, which disguised the age makeup. And as the scene progressed, the red key lights were gradually replaced with green lighting. And since it's black and white film, that change didn't register in terms of lighting, but it made McCarthy's face appear to age spontaneously. And just like the way that they captured it was really fantastic. And it's such a clever way to do it. I think it was used in a couple other movies, or I think one movie previous to this. I can't remember the name. I can't remember what movie, but yeah, there's a really good anecdote in the commentary, Kevin McCarthy's commentary, where he talks about how he was talking to the makeup artist, and they were I wish I could remember what movie, but they were saying like, yeah, we did this in so and so movie, and the guy was paid like $5,000 to do it, and then he says like, yeah, but for this I'm doing the exact same thing again, but I'm only making I can't remember how much he said, but it was a significant drop. I think like a couple $100 or something like that. But the effect in the finished product, or the finished shot of him transforming, and then there's a cut back, or there's a cut to Sam, and then it cuts back to Walter in extremely aged makeup, and that shot is so creepy and unsettling, and it's disturbing, and all of that is compounded by the kind of depressing feel of it as well. And I thought that shot alone was just highly, highly effective. And then it's kind of punctuated by him getting up and falling to the ground. And I just thought that was just such a wonderful way to bring it all home and end the episode on it. Just really, really fantastic. I really appreciate the effects that they used and what they achieved back in the 1960s. So, as far as cultural subtext or the theme or the messages of this episode, it tackles the subject of immortality the way that a lot of fiction seems to. It's kind of a warning about, don't worry about living, don't worry about achieving immortality, or it talks about the downside of immortality and the loneliness of immortality. And that's kind of a common theme with these types of stories that I've seen, at least. But where Twilight Zone succeeds in it is it succeeds in depicting this story in such an eloquent way, without being overly dramatic or turning into different cliches or what have you. There's a message that's buried here that's just simply a pretty simple message to, cherish your life, enjoy your life as it is. We're only here for so long. But it's not hit over the audience's head, and it kind of brushes against its different discussion points and different themes, but it leaves the audience to ponder the details of it, and it really brings for good discussion and dissection of it. And I think Walter talking about how he wishes he would die and how he doesn't have the guts to do it felt really poignant for the character. And I kind of imagine that it would have resonated with war vets when it aired, and even people today dealing with PTSD and other like mental issues. That's just something that I thought of. And on a similar note to that, this isn't stated, or this isn't explored in the episode, obviously, but I was kind of left wondering if Walter fought in the Civil War and maybe other wars throughout his life seeking death. I think that would have been an interesting angle to explore, like this notion that he's living, he's immortal, and he's kind of lucky that he's immortal but not impervious to injury or mortal wounds. So I thought it would have been an interesting angle to explore if he was seeking death in an honorable way. But obviously this episode didn't have the screen time to devote to that. It wasn't the story that they were telling. And obviously it would have to be expanded or something. As far as trivia for this episode, it's somewhat ironic that Walter Jameson in this episode mentions the date of September 11th when reading the journal. Because Kevin McCarthy died on September 11th, 2010. And also, the episode, according to trivia, it could have potentially inspired a fellow Twilight Zone writer, Jerome Bixby, to write a novel. He wrote a novel titled The Man from Earth, which is a story about a history professor who reveals to his friends that he is immortal. Although the tone and age and method of immortality and pretty much everything about the story, according to trivia, is kind of different. But it's interesting to see that they still work in the same framework together, both this episode and that novel. And it's worth mentioning that Jerome Bixby also wrote a similar themed episode of Star Trek, the original series. In 1969, he wrote Requiem for Methuselah. Also, kind of rounding out trivia, actor Kevin McCarthy, he cited this performance. He would cite the performance in this episode as seemingly having come true in his own life, because he remained in good health and he continued to act while outliving most of his family and colleagues. And he, like I said, he died September 11th, 2010. He was 96 years old, and he had an acting credit as late as 2010, which was obviously more than 50 years after this episode was produced. So that's kind of interesting. Okay, so we've come to my kind of closing thoughts on Long Live Walter Jameson. Overall, I really liked how this episode felt and how introspective and thought-provoking it was, much like a lot of these Twilight Zone episodes are. In Serling's opening narration, I neglected to mention this in the review, but in his opening narration, he says that it's the opening scene is Act 1, Scene 1 of a nightmare. But again, and I kind of feel like I'm nitpicking Serling's narrations, and I don't mean to, but this doesn't really seem to play out as much of a nightmare. Maybe it's the nightmare of being found out and potentially not being able to be with the woman he loves. But instead, it's, I think, taking precedence over that more than anything is that this is an intellectual play about aging and the futility of pursuing immortality and the finite nature of human life. And most of all, it just introduces us to an interesting and charismatic character in Walter Jameson, and it does so without pitting him against the surreal or villainous or some weird thing that would have taken away from the story and the dialogue between them. We get really great insight into him and his history that's tied to the story unfolding. And I really respect that. I respect those narrative choices, those story beats, and the way the episode was written. I really respect that, and I really enjoyed it. And that will conclude my review of Long Live Walter Jameson. And of course, before we move on to this week's bonus review, here's a highlight from episode 171 of The Obsessive Viewer, a weekly movie and TV podcast that I host with my friends Mike and Tiny over at obsessiveviewer.com.
It's interesting because it kind of tackles like a serious issue, like how women were more integrated into the workforce as opposed to, just being secretaries and waitresses and nurses. Women are capable of far more than that, and it kind of pokes fun at how men reacted to that during this time period. So it takes a serious thing and makes light of it. So that's an interesting way into a workplace comedy, is that you're taking something that's an actual problem or an issue and poking fun at it. But it does it respectfully. It's not. It doesn't turn it into. It doesn't make it a joke. It's just funny.
Of course, you can find The Obsessive Viewer on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and at obsessiveviewer.com. And you can find the episode that you just heard a clip from at obsessiveviewer.com/OV171. So this week's bonus review is episode 10 of the X-Files' sixth season, titled Tithonus. And I still don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but that's neither here nor there. This episode was recommended to me by listener Greg, and I was really excited about it because, as I mentioned last week, I have not watched the X-Files since I was a kid. So it was really cool to jump in and see an episode out of sequence, because obviously it's all pretty episodic anyway. But it was really cool to just kind of jump in, and it makes me want to go back and rewatch every bit of the X-Files. So this episode is about a case that Scully gets assigned to, outside of, like, she and Mulder are separated, and she's assigned this case of a guy who photographs death scenes and with some peculiar situations surrounding them. So she's assigned this task, or she's assigned this case, and she finds out that this photographer has some interesting X-File-y traits about him. And obviously this episode deals with immortality. Otherwise, I wouldn't be reviewing it alongside Long Live Walter Jameson. But the way that it deals with it is really cool. I really liked it. It's got this effect where the photographer guy, he sees death in characters, and the way it's depicted on screen is that they're grayed out. They are in black and white moments before they die. So he's kind of like following these people around for a very interesting reason that I won't get into because I don't want to spoil it. But the reveal at the end is, or the reveal as to why he's pursuing these, or he's so connected to these people's deaths, is very satisfying to me. One thing that I noticed almost immediately, Breaking Bad's creator, head showrunner, everything, Vince Gilligan was I think it was that he got his start in the X-Files, or that's how he learned how to run a show. He started writing for the X-Files, and then he became a producer and all that. This episode was actually written by him, and I thought that it was kind of cool because I was excited about that. But the way that it unfolded to me was that, if you're a fan of Breaking Bad, then, like, the episode opens with everyone at the FBI answering phones or calling for background checks and stuff, and there's like kind of a Mulder throws out the name like, yeah, Mrs. Ehrmantraut. And like I heard that and I was like, that's interesting. Oh, I wonder if this episode was written by Vince Gilligan, because obviously Mike in Breaking Bad has that same last name. And it's a unique last name, so I kind of figured like, well, maybe Vince Gilligan threw that in there. And it made me wonder like how he got the name Mike Ehrmantraut. So I'm getting sidetracked and everything, but imagine my excitement when I saw that this was written by Vince Gilligan after trying to haphazardly put that together after just hearing a throwaway name. And the way that he wrote the story and the way that the story unfolds is really, really satisfying. Like I said, I really liked it. There is this really nice procedural aspect to it that I wasn't really aware of the X-Files doing much of that, but I really, really liked it. Cause it's kind of like like I said, it's a procedural. So it's like Scully and this other agent are working this case. Scully's checking in with Mulder, and Mulder's checking in on her. And it has this very nice flow and this nice feel to it, this kind of procedural feel to it. And I really liked it. And I like the idea of Scully, and granted, I haven't seen the rest of the series, but I know enough about the characters. I have enough memories of watching the show as a kid to know that Scully's the skeptical one and Mulder's the believer, and that's why they work together so well. But what I liked about this is that Scully is on her own. She doesn't have Mulder leading the charge, and she's the one that's kind of being pulled into recognizing the case as an X-File. And I like the way that it played out. And, also this is kind of apropos of nothing, and I don't know I don't know if this was something. I don't know if it's really worth mentioning, but Scully was definitely giving off a very Clarice Starling vibe to me in this episode. And yeah, I don't know. I can't say much more without going into spoilers, but I really enjoyed the episode, and thank you, Greg, for recommending it. And I'm really going to have to find time to go back and start the series from the beginning, because I mean it's such an icon of television at this point. And there's so much stuff to go through with it, so I'll have to check it out. But of course I need to do that after I after I do my bonus reviews for Black Mirror, and I'm also in the middle of watching Stranger Things, which I really, really love. But again, I haven't had the time to watch it, so I'm only like 3 episodes in, but I'm hoping to get caught up on that. So anyway, that will about do it for this week's episode of Anthology. Thank you guys for listening once again. And once again, you can always email me your thoughts at matt@obsessiveviewer.com. Follow me on Twitter at obsessiveviewer. You know, everywhere to find me. Facebook page at facebook.com/anthologypod. Just got a lot of new Facebook likes, so any new listeners, I appreciate it. And thank you for listening. And next week I will be reviewing episode 25 of the Twilight Zone's first season, People Are Alike All Over. And for the bonus review of that, I'll be reviewing Target Earth, a 1954 sci-fi movie that is available in its entirety on YouTube. So feel free to watch that before the next episode comes out. So having said all that, thank you guys again for listening, and I'll see you guys next week. Thank you for listening to Anthology, presented by ObsessiveViewer.com. You can find more episodes at AnthologyPod.com, and you can subscribe to the show on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or your preferred podcast app. If you'd like to help support the podcast, please take a few minutes to leave a rating and a review on iTunes. The more reviews I get, the higher the show will be ranked in iTunes search results, making it easier for people to discover it and grow the podcast. Of course, you can always email me your thoughts and feelings about the show to matt@obsessiveviewer.com. You can also tweet me at obsessiveviewer, like the Facebook page at facebook.com/anthologypod, or you can call and leave me a voicemail at 317-762-6099 for a chance to have it played on the show. If you like what you've heard here, I urge you to check out The Obsessive Viewer, a weekly movie and TV podcast I host with my friends Mike and Tiny. Also check out the Obsessive Viewer blog at obsessiveviewer.com, where I write movie reviews, TV reviews, and the occasional editorial about the business of entertainment. If you want even more obsessive content in your life, subscribe to the Obsessive Viewer subreddit at r/obsessiveviewer, and check out obsessivebooknerd.com, our sister site for book reviews, author spotlights, and a general celebration of reading. Finally, if you're philosophically curious, check out my friend Tiny's side project podcast, The Secular Perspective, which explores the concepts of faith, religion, and existence from the perspective of secular hosts. You can find that at thesecularperspective.com. Once again, thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you next time.